Hello and welcome. My name is Al Barrows, and this is UFO Disclosure, the podcast that's meant to show an average person's reaction to all the UAP, UFO news from everywhere and anywhere. Today, I'd like to relate a story I found on Street of Silence. It involves a photographer who took several photos of a UFO in Mexico. He later claimed to have been abducted by this very same UFO. The photos themselves have been thoroughly investigated and deemed highly credible. So, in the early morning hours of January 1981, Carlos Diaz, a photographer, drove into a national forest located just outside of Mexico City. Diaz pulled his car into a parking lot in the dark and there waited for a journalist who he would be working with on an assignment. And as Diaz waited in his humid car in the darkness, he suddenly spotted something strange in the air. There was an orange bright light over the hill around 100 feet from his car. Diaz believed initially that it was a forest fire. However, he looked closer. It clearly was not. Diaz grabbed his camera sitting next to him and snapped several photos of the strange orange light. At that point, the car started shaking and shut off. Diaz hopped out of the car and shot two more photos of the object. Next, a stunned Diaz watched as the craft sped off into the sky. If you guys have a visual on this is one of the photos that he took. So this part of the story is fascinating in and of itself, but it's not the full story. Carlos just couldn't get those photos out of his mind. In the following weeks, Diaz kept thinking about his sighting and experience, and eventually he kept returning to the spot in hopes of seeing and again photographing the craft. For weeks, he tried, and then finally, on March the 23rd, 1981, his luck would change. While hiking, he would spot the bright orange oval craft again. It was raining and foggy, so he didn't have a great view of it. So he decided to hike closer to the object to improve his vantage point. He eventually managed to get quite close and positioned himself just under the craft. It was around 100 feet above him, and Diaz decided to stay hidden behind some rocks. Diaz was able to make out more details on the craft at this point. It had semicircles all over it and a smooth ring around the center. While watching it, suddenly someone grabbed his shoulder from behind. At that point, Diaz passed out, and strangely, when he woke up, his clothes were all dry, even though it had just been raining. He knew that something had happened to him, but he wasn't sure what. Diaz began walking to his car, and when he reached it, he would see a strange being. The being had white blonde hair, pale skin, and fit the description of a Nordic alien. The entity would converse with Diaz and tell him if he wanted to know what happened to him, that he should return tomorrow around noon. And the next day, Carlos returned to the very same spot. Diaz returned and saw the entity sitting on the grass. The being spoke to Diaz and told him that he was the one who grabbed his shoulder. He had descended from the craft down to the ground. He went on to say his memories of what had happened to him would return over time. And as time progressed, Diaz's memories would come back. Diaz recalled that the day he fainted, the craft had descended down toward him with the bright orange light right above him. Diaz reached out his hand and touched the craft. His hand seemed to get absorbed by the bright light, and the next thing he remembered was waking up in a gigantic cave. The craft was parked near him, and surprisingly, what looked like other people were there. The being with Diaz would lead him out of the massive cave and into a smaller one. In there would be 7 yellow egg-shaped orbs. Diaz was asked to step in one of the orbs, and when he did, he sensed or could feel the environment of the national forest that he was in. He couldn't touch anything, and the being informed him that the orbs were used to store information about different habitats. He then came out of the orb and was returned back to his car. But this wasn't the end of his contact with the aliens. Diaz claimed that they continued to communicate with him. As far as the photos taken by Diaz have been thoroughly investigated by several different researchers and have been deemed highly credible. Professor Victor Quesada of the Polytech Institute of the University of Mexico found these photographs very credible. Professor Quesada was shocked to discover that the spectrum of light from the object was unlike anything they had ever seen. He stated it didn't match anything in their databanks, and the light was extraordinarily intense. They concluded there was no evidence of superimposition or it being a hoax. They estimated the object to be around 90 to 150 feet in diameter. In addition, there were several witnesses who had stated they had also seen a strange glowing orange object at the very same time that Diaz took his photos. There was also a Michael Hessman, a German ufologist, that would interview Diaz, and he found his story to be credible too. In his report, he noted that Diaz was in constant contact with the beings and that Diaz believed that they were living among us. John Mack, a famous professor at Harvard Medical School, also looked into the case and stated he believed it was one of the most convincing he has ever come across. Robert Nathan, a UFO skeptic who worked at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, also examined the photos as well and believed that they were real. So this case is well known inside the UFO community, but not as well known outside of it. I think that Carlos Diaz's claim of being abducted after taking the photos led many to cast doubt on his story and think it was all a hoax. The story itself has been researched many times over the years, and I don't think the photos themselves have ever been debunked. My name is Al Barrows. This has been UFO Disclosure. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks.